Welcome, everybody. The Georgia Tech Library is pleased to present a book discussion today with Professor and author Ruth Kanfer. Today's discussion will be moderated by my colleague, Marley Gibbons.
Thank you, Catherine. I am very pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Ruth Canfer. Dr. Canfer is Professor of Psychology and Director of the Work Science Center at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She is a Fellow of the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, the Association for Psychological Science, the American Psychological Association, and the Academy of Management. Her research examines the role of motivation and self-regulation in work and achievement settings. Good morning, and thank you for joining us, Dr. Canfer. I'm curious to hear how you and your colleagues who co-authored the book with you first got interested in this aspect of the workplace, the ageless talent aspect.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Well, my colleagues and I, Lisa Finkelstein, Donald Truxello, and Franco Fraccoli, have all come at it different ways. I became interested in older work motivation about 30 years ago when I was working on an age discrimination case. And one of the company officials argued, as if it was a well-known fact, that older workers just have less motivation than younger workers. It's just as though a person's work motivation runs down to empty in older age. And his conviction about this and how it countered my observations about a number of older individuals led me to begin to do research on whether and how age-related differences, age-related changes affect work motivation and engagement in reemployment success. So with a number of other colleagues, we began to publish theoretical, empirical papers on this from a lifespan perspective, book chapters, and 2 books on aging and work motivation. And recently had the honor of working with colleagues on a National Academy of Sciences report on the problems that are associated with thinking about people and employees solely in generational terms. So as the workforce and I continue to age, I am pleased by the progress we've made in dispelling the long-standing negative stereotype about work motivation among mature workers.
And you mentioned the report, and this is actually not the first book that you and these same colleagues have published in this area. So can you tell us about this new book, Ageless Talent, and how it differs from the first book that your team wrote on this topic?
Well, the first book, which was called Facing the Challenges of a Multi-Age Workforce, a Youth-Inspired Approach, was the same great team. But it was an edited book, not an authored book, and it was much thicker. And we wrote some of the chapters, but we mainly solicited chapters from other top-notch up-and-coming scholars about where the research needed to headed and other issues that intersected with aging. So in 2015, Lisa and I had the honor of being part of a team that was to deliver a congressional briefing on the aging workforce on behalf of the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. And this book was part of the Society's academic book series, and it had just come out. So SIOP representatives provided complimentary copies of the book to all the congressional aides attending the briefing. But we noticed that some of the staffers were leaving the book on the table. And Lisa and I realized that although the book served a very important purpose in the scholarly literature, it didn't address the practical and pressing needs of the group of staffers we were talking about. So we talked it over and decided to write a short, practice-focused book, action-oriented book that was science-based, but accessible, digestible, readable, and useful to a broad audience of manager, leaders, and policy makers, and that's this book, Ageless Talent. That's how we got here.
Okay. And I think that I'll just mention, I love that you call it an airport book. So what's it like to write for this other audience, this non-scholarly audience?
Well, when we started, we said it's an airport book because we wanted it to be thin enough that you wouldn't be adverse to buying it in an airport and carrying it around, where every ounce counts. Okay, little did we know, we started this just before the pandemic, that airports would be closed, but we would keep writing the book. And now that we're fortunate, now that the book is out, the airports are reopened. I think one of the real challenges is to write a book that is based on science, but is readable to people who don't have that kind of background. So it took a lot of back and forth with all of us, and to get it down to, I think it's 170 pages or something, so it's pretty brief, but it provides a lot of examples and a lot of results that have come out of scientific interventions, and it's really meant to inspire leaders and managers about the things that they can do and the Peera, how they can do it.
All right. Well, thanks for sort of getting us started and getting us a little more familiar with the topic and what it means to you. I would actually like to invite a couple of colleagues that are joining us from the Georgia Tech Human Resources Office. Candace Bovian is with us. She's the program manager within GTHR's Employee Engagement Department, where she manages employee well-being programs. And she's been at Tech for 6 years. And Ivy Gardner is also with us. She is Director of Employee Relations, which is a unit within Georgia Tech Human Resources. In her current role, she's responsible for leading the Employee Relations Department in providing strategic advice and consultation to managers on organizational policy and process matters, updating human resources policies and procedures, and conducting training sessions on employment-related matters. And I know that they have a lot of questions for you about your work, and especially how it pertains to the very diverse workforce at Georgia Tech. So I think Ivy is going to have the first question for us.
Yes, thank you, Marley. Dr. Canfer, thank you again for being with us. So my question is, your book highlights the Peera approach, and that's the P-I-E-R-A. Tell me, what is that and how does it work?
Okay. So it's a framework or a way of thinking about really doing many interventions to try to improve the environment for, I think all workers, but we have in mind oftentimes the more mature, aging, older workers. And here it stands for planning, implementation, evaluation, reflection, and adjustment. So those are things that I think are pretty self-explanatory, except we really spell out the approach in terms of what we mean by planning, which means what is our goal? What is the specific outcome we want to accomplish? And what is the plan that we're going to use to get here? We're really often good at setting goals, but we're not as good at delineating the plan for getting there, the means for getting there. And we're often even less good at delineating a backup plan if something should happen, which it always does. The second about implementation, the second step is really to focus on monitoring progress and to look at and provide ongoing feedback during an intervention, no matter how small. And reviewing is very similar at the end of this pre-design period to look at, similar to evaluation, to look at how did we do? What were the good things? What were the bad things? Now that's pretty common, and that's oftentimes where we stop. But we argue in this book that there are two more really important steps that have to do with the orientation of really developing successful interventions based on scientific results. One is reflection. That this oftentimes when we evaluate, we say, oh, it was good or it's bad, it worked or it didn't, but we don't really spend a lot of time talking about what worked and what didn't work and why do we think that was the case. And we argue in the Peera approach that reflection, or the last R, is a really important aspect of a successful intervention. And finally, adjustment. And the idea here is, even if something doesn't work, we don't walk away from it. That in fact, we maintain a future focus. We think about how it could be improved. Evaluation is often past oriented. It's oriented towards how well things worked in the past, how well people performed in the past. But adjustment is future oriented. It says, okay, how can we how can we build in continuous improvement or a learning framework into the way that we do our intervention? So Peera stands for that orientation and those steps.
Thank you. And how can a manager here at Georgia Tech use the Peera framework in conjunction with our performance management process, which includes 4 phases: the planning, managing, reviewing, and rewarding phases?
Well, I think they mesh very nicely. I think the Peera strategy would basically argue that planning should be really clear in terms of what are the objectives, that it should be participative, that it should be in coordination with the employer, the workers' goals and abilities, and that we need to identify the criteria for success very early on at the start during the planning phase. And then managing is similar to implementation, and reviewing is similar to evaluation, but we would add the last 2 phases of reflection and adjustment, that in these steps that we take to try to improve the workplace, that we continue to think about what it's like a debriefing, like they do in healthcare after a surgery. What went right? What went wrong? What should we do? How would we change it next time if we were to do it again? And so how would we adjust it with an orientation towards continuing to improve?
Dr. Canfer, hi.
Hi.
What are some of the major challenges employers currently face in managing an aging and age-diverse talent pool?
Well, there's quite a few. I mean, I think managers face a lot of challenges nowadays. That's only one of them, I think. We are at a place where you probably heard, you can have 4 generations or cohorts in your workplace. So age diversity is common. Other kinds of diversity are also common, but the issue the challenges they face are finding ways to connect people, finding ways to build a common bond, to be inclusive in a diverse work group, to have individuals in a team, be it a team or a unit, help one another and not become focused simply on making premature judgments about differentness of themselves from other people. And that's really important for 2 reasons. One, there is no question that older workers are going to become a permanent feature of the U.S. workforce. They are already the fastest growing segment of the U.S. workforce, the 65 and older, and soon will represent probably near a quarter of the workforce. So age diversity is here to stay. And and that's a very important aspect of maintaining full participation, and working longer is a very important feature for U.S. productivity and well-being in general. With that said, I think the answer really here is that oftentimes, and I've done a lot of work on reemployment and age issues and reemployment success, is that stereotypes about older workers, more mature workers, often get in the way of the kinds of collaboration and motivation that keeps older workers feeling like they belong, like they can perform, like that they can, from utilizing all of their skills as long as they remain in the workplace. So those are the challenges the manager has with respect to age diversity.
Thanks. That kind of ties nicely to my next question. Your book talks about the factors that contribute to workability. So what does that mean, and how can organizations and supervisors affect an employee's workability?
So it's a Finnish term that really started with talking about the number of medical issues that a worker had, and the more medical issues that they had, the more likely they were to probably retire or not remain in the workforce longer. And it's broadened since then, and it's actually not just in terms of physical medical issues, but it really talks about the individual's ability to bring forth the physical and the interpersonal and the cognitive resources that are demanded for his or her job. And so workability is really, it's flexible. It doesn't reside just within the individual. It also depends on what the job is. So, for example, one of the interventions that has become pretty popular and is studied quite a bit now is job crafting, which is changing the job and the task responsibilities so that you have a better match between what an individual can do and what an individual wants to do, and what the job tasks are. So workability is really something that isn't just about an individual, it is about fit.
And Dr. Canfer, I have the next question. So how should organizations approach the T and D of managers and leaders for managing an age-diverse workforce?
Well, that's been a question that's been asked a lot. So one of the stereotypes that has been dispelled in science, but remains popular, I think, unfortunately, in the literature, in the popular literature, is that more mature workers don't like to learn. That for some reason that they don't like learning. However, the example I always give is an example of a older person who years ago, when computers were first introduced, and older workers said, no, I can't use computers, and it's just too hard to learn. Then their children put pictures of their grandchildren online. And lo and behold, a lot of older people learned how to use computers and became actually quite proficient with computers for that purposes. So I think that it is a big mistake to think that older individuals can't learn. They can learn. Now, do they learn as quickly, and do they learn in the same way that maybe a 20-year-old does? No, because oftentimes there are age-related differences. So, for example, we know from science that more mature workers tend to value self-paced tasks rather than other-paced. They learn better in self-paced. They often take a little bit longer because when it's self-paced, they will review the material more often. But they learn. And so I think there are two things. One of the things that science also tells us is that one of the most important things that you can do is provide supervisory support for training and development to encourage your employees, your older employees, to learn, to take the plunge. That a lot of people are concerned about looking bad, particularly to their supervisors. And I think to the extent supervisors are extremely important in providing that motivation and support for getting engaged. And when the learning process is tuned well to the demands of learning, the age-related demands of learning for the employee, then it's actually can be a very strong self-reinforcing process.
So, Dr. Canfer, I have a couple of pandemic-related questions for you. This first one, the pandemic has added another layer of complexity to the challenges you described. How do you think things will unfold as the world goes back to work and back to the office?
Well, that is the multi-million-dollar question, literally, if not billion-dollar question. Many people are trying, and organizations are trying to figure that out. And we are just beginning to see what the consequences of a lockdown have been and what's possible. On the good side, we found out that that people could actually do their jobs remotely. Many people could. That people who were able to work remotely did continue to work remotely. On the negative side, we found that it was exhausting for a lot of people and led to some burnout. And now you hear reports of people who don't want to go back to work, period. They might even quit or they will stay remote. I think the few things are clear, and some of the economists have looked at this, and Department of Labor. The people who have been hurt probably, it's called, really a double disruption is what it's been called. Not only do you have the pandemic, which actually put older people at risk for being in work settings, but you also have this opportunity for increased the speed of technological innovation in the workplace. So organizations actually improved that this was happening before, but they really increased the speed with which they developed new technologies, which led, in fact, to job displacement. And so a lot of people who lost their jobs have found out that those jobs are no longer there, and they're going to need to reskill. So a few things are clear. Older workers and women, particularly in lower wage jobs, have been most negatively affected by this pandemic and the associated increased development in technologies. And so for women, the burnout with the additional responsibilities oftentimes of childcare makes job recovery really quite difficult, even if they have a job to go back to. And then the lagged return of educational and childcare options makes it even more precarious, and because that transition is not smooth. It's not. It's sometimes their responsibilities and for people who like to segment their work to work and non-work, it's not going to be segmented for some time. So for working mothers, the cost of childcare, the job displacement, and the need to reskill or educate further for reemployment, it requires a fairly heavy lift from not just organizations and managers and support from managers, but also from business itself and the public sector. Now,
Yeah.
I was going to say one thing that a lot of organizations are looking at is hybrid work, okay, which is part-time remote work. And I know even at Georgia Tech, there's been a discussion of hybrid work even before the pandemic in some units. There are pros and cons, and actually, this has yet to be really fully studied. It's not clear whether or not hybrid work will exacerbate or marginalize employee groups like women and older workers who might, in fact, be most at risk, okay, for feeling not engaged or involved in their unit. And it's not clear how hybrid work affects the productivity of the unit as a whole. And these are the kinds of questions that major organizations are struggling with now. One thing that will have to happen, though, is that there will need to be more interventions, family-friendly interventions and innovations, and finding ways to coordinate work and non-work demands, not at the cost of psychic exhaustion for the employee.
That is so true, and I can totally relate. And my second question, I think you actually hit on it with your answer. The second question was about working mothers in the pandemic and how they had additional responsibilities at home, and some had to leave the workforce entirely. And I was going to ask, how do you think this will impact the workforce going forward? But I think you did touch on that.
Yeah. Not quite sure yet what's going to happen, but a lot will depend on what policies organizations put into play and what supervisors do to provide support for those women as they come back in, or caretakers, even if they're men, as they come back in. And I should mention that some older workers play a very important caretaking role, sometimes for grandchildren, sometimes for others who are sick or whatever, that all of these groups are really going to need some support and help at each level, at multiple levels. Yeah.
So, Dr. Canfer, in talking about that, how do you think that more remote work will affect managing an age-diverse workforce?
It's hard to know. But I think that we know certain things about aging, having to do with sociability and the importance of feeling, all people, all employees or people who are engaged in the labor force, typically, hundreds of studies show there's really three things that people want. They want a sense of fairness in the workplace. They want a workplace, a working experience where they can feel valued and appreciated and achieve. And they want a sense of purpose and to know what they're doing, that they're connected, right? And belonging. And the problem with remote work is, as you get older, that sense of self and getting a positive sense of self from others around you is a social phenomenon that maybe Zoom can't quite cover. There are certain things that happen interpersonally, the informal things that happen interpersonally, the touch on the shoulder or the impromptu remark, which you can't capture in Zoom because only one person can talk at a time, right? That may lead older workers to feel that it's less satisfying. It's going to, I think, take some creativity to make remote work satisfying in that sense, in terms of the social and the belonging factor for mature workers.
I have a question on aging workers. So the Department of Labor estimates that older workers represent a larger and larger percentage of the U.S. workforce over the next few decades. At present, many boomers are now working well into their 70s. This means supervisors may increasingly be managing older workers. What can managers do to support employee engagement and motivation to develop them? And does the growing number of older workers impact how managers build productive teams?
Yes, that's a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah. I can break it down if you need me to. So the first part was basically what can managers do to support employee engagement and motivation to develop them?
I think one of the most important things is to listen and to actively involve, to check in with workers. I mean, this is probably true at any age, to find out what are their issues, what are their aspirations, what can be done to make the workplace a more exciting place for them, to reduce some of the stresses that they might be feeling, and to include oftentimes it's about not feeling a sense of inclusivity or belonging, right? And so particularly for older workers, and what can be done even at a climate level. So you have multiple interventions. You can do things at a climate level in terms of the enforcing the norms and values of inclusivity. You can do things that are potentially physical demands. We talk about this example at BMW of, the older workforce. I think the mean age was 47, I think, in the production line. And what they did was they built a new production line just of older workers, and then they looked at things that they could do to reduce their sense of fatigue, their fatigue, and so on. They changed out the flooring. They provided ergonomic chairs. They had sit-stand desks. These things really reduced some of the stress that older workers felt, increased their sense of future, that they could actually work longer under these modified conditions, and increase productivity on the line by 7%, which of course is big thing. So
yeah, that's huge. So the second part was, does the growing number of older workers impact how managers build productive teams?
Well, I think it means there's going to be more diversity, and I think that it's more important to monitor and actively intervene and make sure that, in fact, team members are communicating without, and not that communication networks and collaborations are not being run by stereotypic judgments, rather than by who has the information and who can help who, and doing backup behaviors. We did a study, which it's funny about teams, they organize themselves oftentimes into who can do what, but stereotypes that are not just acting on the basis of stereotypes can really impede a team's productivity that way. And I give the example of the interns, which I guess were filmed at Georgia Tech. That was partially at Georgia Tech, which was about the two older gentlemen who were interns and were at first rejected by, it was a movie where they were, first rejected by the younger interns. But by the end of the movie, and it was really clear after you got past the stereotypes, that they offered and contributed to the problems of the group in very unique and valuable ways. And I think that's really what needs to happen. And does happen. Some of the scientific research shows it can happen when you get rid of those stereotypes.
Thank you, Dr. Canfer. I'm going to toss it back to Marley for any questions that we may have in the Q&A.
Yeah, and actually we have questions that are kind of flip sides of the same coin. But going back to how managers can best support more mature employees, the question is about specifically younger managers. And I know that you like to talk about sort of age-related development more than generations.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could, kind of get at that with an answer about how younger managers can best support more mature employees.
Well, I think we're going to see more of that. We're already seeing more of that. We're halfway through the boomer generation, hitting 65, right? I think this is, again, a problem in being authentic and not necessarily. There's a tendency, I think, sometimes for younger, inexperienced managers to look across the desk at an older individual and think of their parent. And maybe pull back and not provide feedback and use and have stereotypes that may be very idiosyncratic. Oh, this person doesn't really need this feedback because they're not going to be in the workforce very long or whatever. And I think that managers need to really understand, refocus their orientation towards older workers. And that refocus needs to be about really what are the demands of the task and what are the resources of the individual and how can I provide a better fit? And how can I work with this employee to provide a better fit that is motivating, engaging, and something that the individual can do successfully? And so I think it's a reframing of the conversation. It is, in fact, that assumptions that one makes about older workers, that they aren't interested in learning or that they can't perform as well or they lack passion, need to be let go. And instead, what the focus has to be is finding out what are the resources and capabilities and competencies and desires and motives of these workers. And so how can we work together to get a fit?
And I actually have a question of my own before I get back to the Q&A from the audience. But I know that your area of focus is motivation. And I was wondering if you could just talk very generally about how motivation changes as we age.
Well, very generally, I mean, it doesn't ever go away. It changes in its focus. So there's some evidence in the lifespan literature, well, a fair amount of evidence, that early in life, during young adulthood and so on, we're in a more instrumental phase, that our motivation is directed towards acquisition. And that matches very nicely with our competencies. We have really strong memory when we're 25, and we are looking to use that to develop and to learn and to acquire, right? And to succeed and build our careers. And as we get older, some of those competencies slightly decline, but it's also the case that we've acquired and we move into our motives in midlife and later life tend to be towards more experiential in terms of, and generative in terms of transmitting what we know and utilizing what we know to the good of our colleagues and to the good of the organization. This is a really powerful set of motives for helping managers and organizations if they can tap into it. And so that's how our motive focus changes. But our motivation in terms of our capacity for energizing ourselves and putting our mental effort towards something doesn't really change. Yes, there is some slight decline. Probably, I know I can't do all-nighters the way I used to, even if I really want to. I mean, I can, but I pay much more dearly for it than I did when I was 25. But that aside, I think it's really important to realize and to know what your employees want to accomplish. Oftentimes, I think managers and leaders don't make good use of the potential of older workers for contributing to organizational goals and objectives, because they never ask them what they think they can do for the organization.
And that actually leads us really nicely into the flip side of the previous question, which is about the employee. So do you have advice for mature employees in a multi-generational workplace where there are these age-related or generational differences between managers and coworkers?
Really good question. Really good question. And the same thing applies. There is a little evidence that as you get older, you tend to be a little bit quicker making stereotypic judgments than when you're younger, believe it or not. And so that would suggest that in fact, older workers need to be very careful about not making stereotypic judgments about their younger supervisor or younger colleagues, and instead to listen and to make judgments based on the specifics of the situation. And I also think that there is there's some good evidence to suggest that the importance of proactivity, that older workers need to speak up about what they can contribute and what their limits are. And this proactivity might lead to job crafting, right? That a job that actually can help the unit in unique ways. There's a theory of lifespan development that talks about how over the lifespan people go from accomplishing to accommodating and compensating for various losses, and job crafting is one way to compensate, right? And as organizations become technologically more sophisticated, that compensation becomes more possible. So we'll say, for example, in training, the new technologies for learning and online learning have made it possible for older workers to do learning that they previously might not have been able to do. And in a way that is comfortable and motivating for them. And that's a really important feature, because nobody who starts a job at 25 is going to do that job and be motivated by that job for the next 60 years without crafting it or changing it.
Very good point. So thank you. We have a question actually going back to your comments about the internship movie and, older adults and younger workers and so on. This question is about how can we change the way that older workers are perceived, both by themselves and by organizations? So self-perception and perception by others.
Well, we are all subject, our self-perception are all subject to what we hear others think about people like us. So when we operate in an environment where, and there's a fair amount of research where the norms and the stereotypes run rampant that old people can't do anything, right? That they're in the way, then we tend to think of ourselves as in the way and not able to do as much. So self-perceptions in part depend on the norms and the climate around us. What changes that climate? Well, most people would argue that it's a multi-level, a large-scale intervention, okay, that has to be supported from the top of the organization. There has to be support for inclusion, and in terms of all of the language, symbols, visions that talk about inclusivity, right? And policies and HR policies that are bundled to support longer working life among individuals who are capable and competent, and the adjustment of work to take advantage of their competencies. Those are the it's in the atmosphere, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Do you have sort of a pet stereotype that you love to dispel for people? And it could be about older workers or younger workers or anyone in the middle.
Well, my favorite one, as you probably can imagine, is that older workers are just not motivated anymore. And I see that they don't just, older people don't fill up and die. They are generally motivated, but perhaps not for what you're offering. And the idea is when we had a much more homogenous, age homogenous, and in other ways, workforce, okay? When the boomers were all in their 20s, they all wanted the same things, and promotions and rewards were all, and getting things like that were all great. But as we age, we want different things. And so if we stay with the same reward schedule and reinforcement schedule, it doesn't work. It's not a one size fits all. And it's really hard to understand that organizations actually do have opportunities to provide rewards that are meaningful to older people in terms of belonging, in terms of being valued, in terms of the pride of being associated and doing activities in the organization. So there's a lot of opportunities. There's a great study where to motivate older workers, what they did was they had a family day where the employees could bring in their whole family to see how the plant worked, and to be able to instill pride and extend that motivation beyond just what happens in the walls of the manufacturing plant to actually the family. And I think there are a lot of creative solutions that way. It starts with what has been called by some stay interviews, which instead of exit interviews, which is too late, they're gone, it's interviews while they're there about what it is they're looking for, and how for older employees you can build that. Now, it's probably a good idea for all aged employees, but particularly for older, because we tend not to think about that until we're older.
Well, that is true. That is true. Any favorite stereotype of the younger generation that? I love the image of the younger manager looking across the desk and seeing their parent. Do you find that older workers look across the desk and see their child or grandchild?
Maybe. I think it depends on and there's a lot of variety on what they see, right? Depending on who their children and grandchildren are. I think one of the things that is a stereotype is that, for me, is that younger workers don't care about older workers. I think that is, and I think the pandemic has really put this in perspective a little bit too. That that younger workers don't necessarily have a special treatment they give older workers, which is not to think of them as valuable people, but they're often maybe going fast, or they're working in industries where you go fast and break things, and they don't see very many older people doing that. But I think that's a wrong stereotype. I don't think necessarily that that's true, but it's easy to get that sense because of the segregation, the age segregated employment, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think we have time for one more question, and we have a question that I'll just read the whole thing. I'm intrigued by your comments about the pace and intensity of work. Is that related to insight gained over time, that our urgency is often self-inflicted stress and arbitrary timelines, resulting in unhealthy work patterns that are deleterious to our well-being? Are we bringing it on ourselves?
Wow, there are different opinions upon this. And this question, I think, comes up even more given the pandemic. One of the most interesting questions is, we were able to accomplish work remotely. Did we work harder or less hard? And you know, I don't know of any data I do know that people experience psychological tiredness, but that may be related to the technology and the methods by which we were working, were very drastically different. Even if you were an essential worker, they were drastically different. So this question about, you know, do we bring it on ourselves? I think sometimes we do, but we do. I want to just make the point. Marathon runners bring it on themselves too. They set goals that are very difficult, and they work very hard to achieve them, right? And I think that can happen in the workplace. And one of the most motivating and rewarding aspects of purposeful activity in life is really to set a difficult goal and to achieve it. Now, there need to be limits on that, which say that is not at the cost of losing one's family or, you know, losing one's health. And that is something that I think managers and leaders have an important responsibility in helping employees find those boundaries and staying within them. But I think challenge is a part of human nature. And in fact, and that's true for older workers as well. So.
Well, thank you so much. I would like to thank Candace and Ivy for joining us and asking such insightful questions, and also everyone who contributed questions in our Q&A. And I would especially like to thank Dr. Ruth Canfer for sharing her insights with us, and really for writing such an interesting book that we do have here at the library. And I think Catherine might have a link to share, or has shared a link to that. Catherine, would you like to wrap us up?
Yeah, thank you, Marley. Thank you again, Dr. Canfer. Thank you, Candace and Ivy. What a great benefit to have such expertise in this discussion. And thank you to Marley, our modern languages librarian and library learning consultant. We really appreciate everyone joining. The Georgia Tech Library is committed to providing free and accessible public programming to our community, both here locally and globally. So we hope you will join us for future events. We'll be transitioning in the fall to some in-person events, but we have spaces so that all of our events can be hybrid and accessible to those in Germany, like we had someone here today. So thank you again for joining. We'll make this recording accessible on YouTube and through our institutional repository, Smart Tech, after today's events. We hope you have a good Monday.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you'd like to read the book from today's program, Ageless Talent, Enhancing the Performance and Well-Being of Your Age-Diverse Workforce, please type in the URL at the right to find it at your local library or bookstore. And for more information or questions about work motivation, job and career transitions, workforce aging, and the future of work, contact Dr. Ruth Canfer at her email below.